2, 1, and there we are. Welcome. This is, I'm Richard Dolan and my wife, Tracy.
Hi, everyone.
And we're here. This is Intelligent Disclosure. Thanks for joining us for another week. Happy to be here with you.
Mm-hmm.
So tonight we're going to talk about something that I've liked to talk about a lot, but it's not just Operation Mockingbird, but the successor to Operation Mockingbird. We're talking about media control in the world of today. There's so much, obviously, to talk about. We're going to get into that in a moment. I think we wanted to talk about one or two other things you were wanting to chat about.
Yes, I just realized I put a cough drop in my mouth right before, and I'm going to be crunching on that, trying to get rid of it. That was a mistake.
Do you want me to jump in before you're done with your while you're working on the cough drop?
No, it's all good. It's all good. But I am sort of dealing with that.
All right. That was part of my plan. Like I said 30 seconds before we went on, hey, try a cough drop.
Yeah. And I'm trying to
you can blame me.
Stick it over here. But anyhow, what we're going to tell them about?
Well, why don't we just jump into why we're getting into Mockingbird and its successor today. We were really chatting in our kitchen earlier today.
As we do, as people do.
And we were, last Saturday, I delivered a piece on Julian Assange for a live stream that I did on my own on Saturday. And I was very happy, by the way, about some very good feedback that I've been receiving on that from people. So that's gratifying. But we were chatting about that. And I think, it's striking, first of all, in the vast disparity between how Assange is treated between what we might call mainstream corporate media and alternative media. And it's like a black and white difference. So whereas in the establishment media, they're focusing on his how he's lived like an animal at the Ecuadorian embassy and his huge beard and all these other horrible things he supposedly did, rather than the actual impact that he had on our world. It's only in the so-called alternative media that you get any appreciation. So from there we went into other matters.
We did. I was just saying, sometimes it's difficult, and I see this a lot. I can see this recognize this in myself when I talk to people like my mom and younger demographics, and sometimes people who are just absolutely opposed to this idea
that the media is somehow controlled, or right,
that it's a big leap for them to get there, to understanding that. And, we had members writing in as well saying, I understand Project Mockingbird, but when I talk to other people, I don't know what to tell them in terms of where it's gone, where we are now. How do we fill in that gap? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. No, and it's true. Like I've, for years and years, you and I have talked about Mockingbird. I've talked about it for forever. And it's just one of those things that people really need to understand. I mean, it's a very important part of our history, yes, and understanding that part of our history will have a big impact on how you understand your society today for several reasons. I mean, first, the structures that gave rise to Mockingbird then are still around today. Second, that history, once you understand that history, shows just how easily manipulated people have been by their trusted sources of news. And it happened back in the 50s and 60s. So that may seem historical and that may seem obsolete. But the details are really rather shocking. I mean, starting just after the end of the Second World War, we're talking about deep CIA infiltration of the news and entertainment industries in the US and in the Western world. So the CIA made a point to get its hooks into all of the major purveyors of opinion and thought that existed in the Western world, and they succeeded. And what we learned, this is all scooped, came out during the U.S. Congress intelligence community hearings of the 1970s, and then Carl Bernstein famously wrote a piece on it. Not less than 400 major journalists were on the payroll secretly for the CIA. 400. And we're talking highly positioned, some of the most highly positioned journalists in the world were secretly on the CIA payroll. Now, nowadays, I think a lot of people do know about this, but it's very important to emphasize that none of this was known back at the time. And this wasn't simply innocent, let's do it against the evil Russians for the Cold War stuff, like, fighting the good fight, so to speak. That wasn't it. This was the true creation of real fake news in order to drum up support for overthrowing governments, whether in the 1940s or the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. You get the idea. This went on and on and on. And the older decades are becoming better known a little bit because it's further back in time and it's becoming a little safer to talk about it. But in fact, control over the media has been so well entrenched from the 1980s and onward too. It's never stopped. And it's been used nonstop for the purposes of spreading propaganda, demonization of foreign leaders that are on the bad list, right? It used to be Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad and Vladimir Putin. It just never stops. Once they get on the cover of Time magazine, by the way, is like the ultimate villain bad guy, then you know U.S. is going to start up for some kind of regime change operation. It never stops.
And Time magazine was explicitly named, I believe.
Oh, for Mockingbird. That's exactly right. So Mockingbird,
as were so many others. I mean, not just them.
Mockingbird was CIA infiltration of the New York Times, the Washington Post. CBS, very famously, was probably at the time their closest relationship. But all the major TV news was, all the major international, like Reuters and United Press International and Associated Press. During the Senate hearings on the intelligence community, they were, I think it was William Colby of the CIA who was being questioned. I think it was Colby in the early 70s. And he's being asked, sir, did the CIA have paid journalists in, sensitive news positions in the United States? And he just said, this is really best left to a closed executive briefing. And this happened several times. So clearly CIA was all over the American news media. And not just for foreign policy and geopolitics, but really for domestic control too. And I would just, finish this little segment by saying, I think the greatest irony in our world today, which is filled with ironies of all kinds, maybe one of the biggest ironies is that this media establishment, which has been in bed with the intelligence community for so long, is now telling us that it's trying to protect us from the spread of fake news by alternative news sources. It's the ultimate indignity and irony. So, but yeah, so that's why I like to talk about Mockingbird.
Well, yeah, it's an important thing for people to understand. I mean, I feel like I can't say that enough. And sometimes I know people have been in the chat and writing comments and rolling their eyes, people who've been with Richard for so long, but there's lots of people who don't understand it. So we have to speak to everyone, I believe.
Well, yes.
Because we can't keep preaching to ourselves.
People need to understand this is it. We were talking just before we went on, and you described it very well. You said this is a foundational truth of our world, right? So
that we must know. Yeah,
it is. Like, you really must never forget about it. But it's also fair to say, well, okay, people might say, well, Mockingbird was decades ago. So what about today?
Right.
And is
fair question.
Why don't we hear about this today? Well, the answer to part of that is that, well, you would hear about it if you went out and looked for information about it. It's all there, but you won't hear about it on any of the mainstream news outlets ever, or even entertainment in any kind of serious way. So why aren't the mainstream people reporting it? And well, where's the evidence? Well, we're going to talk about that, but I'm just trying to think where we want to go here right now. Mockingbird. Where Mockingbird has gone since then, I think the big difference today is that today the CIA doesn't need to recruit journalists. First of all, journalists jump over themselves, whether from the CIA or whether with working with the military. These networks and the intelligence agencies want to work with each other. And it's now like out in the open. It's just out in the open. It's not even hidden anymore. Like if these types of relationships were out in the open in the 50s and 60s, I think Americans would have had a real big problem with it. Let me share a couple of slides with people. Did you want to jump in with any other thing?
No, I was just going to say, of course, Anderson Cooper comes to mind. So
Anderson Cooper, I've got a nice little slide here. This is a cheeky little meme-like slide. I figured let's get the memes out of the way now before they become illegal. But in all seriousness, everyone does know about Anderson Cooper, I would think. 2 summers as an intern for the CIA. He's from one of the wealthiest families in America, the Vanderbilts, basically doing work for the hierarchy. That's almost old news, but it's still worth putting out there. He went to Yale University. He was an undergraduate in the late 1980s, and he interned for 2 summers in a row with the CIA. So that's Anderson Cooper, and you could say, who cares, big deal. But it is a big deal, and the reason it's a big deal is that it's just so normal now. This lady, Mika Brzezinski, she's the daughter of this guy. Hold on here. Let me just move ahead. Zbigniew Brzezinski. And by the way, Zbigniew wasn't just into U.S. geopolitical domination and globalism. He was very much involved in managing propaganda campaigns throughout the world in the 1960s and 70s. Anyway, his daughter, Mika Brzezinski, kind of famously recently stated that the job of those in the mainstream media is to control exactly what people think. The actual quote was, she's here talking against Trump on MSNBC, and she says he's trying to undermine the media and trying to make up his own facts, which, yes, sometimes I would not dispute that. And she goes, she says, and it could be that while unemployment and the economy worsens, he could have undermined the messaging so much that he can actually control exactly what people think. And that is our job. I think it just kind of slipped out. And I have no doubt, if she had time to think about that, or she probably would have worded her statement a little differently. But there you go. And I want to talk about some of these other folks who basically dominate so much of the news, these talking heads. They all come from the intelligence community. So over here, you got John Brennan, former CIA director. He's a regular on MSNBC now as a senior national security and intelligence analyst. Basically, MSNBC hired him to compete so they could compete with this network and this guy. This is James Clapper, who is one of the famous liars of modern American history. He was former director of national intelligence, CNN, at CNN, James Clapper. He's the guy who took the oath before Congress and said we were not under surveillance, and then came Snowden's revelations. Over here, you've got Susan Rice. She was President Obama's national security advisor. They recently added her to the board of Netflix, which wins all kinds of Oscars for its anti-Russian, anti-Syria documentaries. Down here, you have Josh Earnest. He's not as well known as some of these other folks, but he was President Obama's press secretary. He's a regular on MSNBC. You got Michael Hayden here, another former CIA director. He's a regular on CNN. What is this? How did this happen that it's suddenly cool and wonderful to hire these former directors of the CIA and have them parade about and act as if they're journalists providing analysis? You've got, this is a gentleman not as well known, Juan Zarate. He's on CBS. He was the deputy national security advisor under George W. Bush. And then here is the General Jack Keane. Let's get a Fox representative in there. He's a retired general, pushes neocon agendas worldwide, and, ceaseless struggle against the Russians. So that's the tiniest smattering of how infiltrated our official voices are in the media by the intelligence national security complex. And of course, what are they about? They're about pushing a war agenda. That's usually at the top of their list, scaring the hell out of people because, hey, $700 billion isn't quite enough to spend on the world's biggest and most expensive military. And you always need more money to overthrow holdout governments that are independent of your will. So how about we talk about Amber Lyon?
She's
We were
super
both.
interesting.
She's a very interesting lady.
And this is the kind of example that people need to hear, I think.
Yeah, Amber Lyon was a CNN journalist. She's, in the years since then kind of gone rogue, which is definitely a good thing. During the early part of the Arab Spring, we're talking March 2011, she was sent along with a team to cover events in the Kingdom of Bahrain. So Bahrain isn't just a close ally of the U.S. Here's a map of Bahrain. It's right there in the Middle East. Here's Saudi Arabia. Okay. Iran over here, United Arab Emirates. It's tiny. Bahrain has been a close ally of the U.S. for a long time, but it's also a close ally of CNN, which was her employer at the time. And we learned all about this. This is through CNN International. That's a major division of CNN. In part thanks to Amber Lyon, and in part thanks to a really great article by Glenn Greenwald. This article, in fact, right here, which he did for The Guardian when once upon a time they did some decent news journalism. But he's talking here about CNN and being in the business of pursuing state sponsors for their news. And it's a reliance on revenue that really jumped up, according to his research, after the 2008 financial crisis, which caused that network, and I think a lot of them, to suffer major financial losses in corporate sponsorships. So just think about what that means. Let me stop sharing here for a second. Bahrain, according to Greenwald, became one of the most aggressive government exploiters of opportunities presented by CNN. So he points out that these arrangements, this isn't your standard advertising that companies will do. This is stuff that CNN will work with their sponsors to produce content.
Right.
And they don't really talk about it. This is really a business relationship, much more than a news journalist relationship. So one of the things is that when Amber Lyon was there in Bahrain, let me share the screen again. Her team wasn't only aggressively shut down by the Bahraini security forces. I mean, they had guys with guns pointing them at them and very strongly intimidating her whole team. But they were brutally cracking down on demonstrators. And she and her team were able to produce a very, very powerful documentary segment on what was then going on. This is spring of 2011. CNN never aired it. She noticed something very odd when she was there. This is one of the things she put in here, was that the U.S. was supplying about $1 billion worth of weaponry, including tear gas, to the Bahraini regime, which was at that very time suppressing all the popular protests in the country. So anyway, they wouldn't put out the documentary. She goes to the highest levels of the government, to CNN to find out why. She never gets a straight answer. And then they let her go. And her claim is that CNN is paid by the U.S. and foreign governments routinely to selectively report on certain events and to make up fake news stories. That is her statement. That's
probably one of the most important slides right there.
Right. And CNN denies it. They're like, oh, she's got everything wrong. And I don't really have that statement or her rebuttal. And Glenn Greenwald both wrote a very, very detailed rebuttal of what CNN denied. Basically, I think they laid it out very clearly. And she actually went even further. At the time, this is during the Obama White House years, she exactly said that network, CNN, was a tool for the then Obama administration to manipulate information and news that the American public gets to see and that the world gets to see.
And again, she's not the only one.
No.
Just one example.
We're going to get to a few others. I would just say, by the way, if you search for this information, like Amber Lyon's revelations and so forth, you're never going to find this on establishment media outlets. You're only going to find it on the alternative news outlets. It's such a dramatic difference between. Now, thank God we've got alternative news. Of course, we're in an era where alternative news is being smeared as fake news.
Right. And for people who are just trying to understand, they don't know what we're necessarily talking about, but they're doing their own investigations and they're trying to understand. This is really confusing when
Right.
they can't figure out what sources to use,
No, that's right.
when exactly what you're saying is happening.
It's tough for people. And most folks really have my sympathy. Not everyone is fanatically devoted to trying to ferret out the truth. And even when you are fanatically devoted, like you really, it's important to know how to do your homework on this. And
right.
And it takes time. It does take time. So, and it's true, like you can go to so-called alternative sites and you can go down some really bad rabbit holes there that lead nowhere, or that are truly misleading. But the question is, just because some alternative sites are misleading, do we therefore think that the establishment vetted, curated sites, there's that new word, they love that, that they're somehow better? Like, of course they're not. The establishment sites are no better at all. In fact, they're often worse. Those are the guys who led us into war in Iraq in 2003. And I just think we should never forget nor forgive all those mainstream established outlets that gleefully pushed a false narrative that allowed for the destruction of an entire region of the world, the Middle East, which has not recovered. It's been almost 20 years. And that monstrosity has still left its mark on that whole region to this day.
I think it's very difficult for people who are just struggling to understand this right now. So
it is. And people don't know what to believe. Like most of us were naturally conservative. We should be naturally conservative, by the way. You don't want to just like change your opinion willy-nilly. And so if you've gone through your whole life trusting certain sources of news, and you get to a certain age in life and suddenly someone's telling you, no, that's all manipulation. It's hard for people. Yeah,
the rug's been pulled out from everyone. So, they're hunting around for what's true and what's not. And the thing is, it seems like everyone just gets so divisive and ends up on one side or the other, kind of like what you were saying before of ending up black or white.
Right.
There's a little bit of a grayscale going on here. But I think when you don't know the whole story, it's good to just stand in the middle and then listen to all of these different narratives and do your best that way.
Listen to alternative points of view, and don't necessarily just sign on to an alternative point of view, but at least listen. Like I'm going to have an RT clip or at least a photograph from an RT thing just a moment. And RT is one of these news agency that has been just trashed, absolutely trashed by Western media, of course. And it's not that everything that comes out of RT is absolutely true. Of course not. But they have a point of view that if you're not listening to that point of view, I can say right now, you're missing out on a huge piece of our reality. The coverage on Assange is a perfect case in point. Like, if you look for news on Julian Assange, you're probably going to find some of the best news out of RT. Certainly much better than any of the mainstream Western sources. So speaking of RT, let me just go to this man here. This is Udo Ulfkotte. He is no longer alive. He just died a couple of years ago, very unexpectedly, of a heart attack. He was 56 years old. He was a German journalist, PhD. And I think it was in 2014 that he came out with a revelation. He wrote a book back then called Gekaufte Journalisten, as journalists for hire in English, or bought journalists. And then he made a couple of interviews, this one for RT here. And he really just talked about how journalists in Europe were universally, seems to me that was his impression, under the threat of job termination, and were routinely, at least he was routinely compelled to publish articles written by intelligence agents using his byline. And he just said, I ended up publishing articles under my own name. This is his book, Journalists for Hire. It's on Amazon. I ended up publishing articles under my own name, he writes, written by agents of the CIA and other intelligence services, especially the German Secret Service. And That's quite interesting. There's this lady, Cheryl Atkinson, who I think is another hero of the modern age. She was a CBS investigative journalist, and she talks quite a bit about astroturfing. This is her book called The Smear. You bought this for me I think it was a Christmas last year. It's a very fine book. And this is astroturfing, the practice of masking the sponsors of a message or organization to make it appear as though it originates from and is supported by a grassroots movement. So that's what she talks about. And
didn't she also talk about there was a really great way to tell a sure sign of astroturfing is when people are going after the speaker as opposed to the truth?
Yeah, I think.
Or what was it exactly?
Well, she was talking not just about astroturfing, but propaganda in general, and how the two of them are very closely interrelated. But yes, indeed, she really talks about. Well, let me just jump ahead to this slide here that I have set up. Where's my? I'm trying to move I need a better system. Here we go. So this is some of the language she says, watch out for when you see, people using this type of language: crank, quack, nutty, lies, paranoid, pseudo, conspiracy. These are classic types of language used as a way to confuse the truth beyond recognition, she says, or controversializing is her word she uses, people who disagree with a certain position. This is widely done, not just by government people, but by corporations. And, what she talks about really is how they will disguise themselves by publishing, having people publish blogs or Facebook accounts or Twitter accounts or letters to the editor or comments online, under the articles that people see online. We know that the US government and the UK government engages in this. They call them sock puppets. Snowden's revelations talked about this quite a lot. But Cheryl Atkinson, in her way, talks about it as well. And she's really talking about the creation of fake grassroots movements funded by political interests, corporate interests, or special interests, basically like false flags. And this is something that the U.S., the CIA has done through the State Department, through USAID, USAID, through international NGOs throughout the world. You basically dump a lot of money into another country and you create a so-called grassroots movement, and your compliant media covers it as if it's legit. And the next thing you know, you got a real revolution on your hands, like in Venezuela today. It's exactly where it's going. So, but yeah, you're talking about language that they use and the way that they go about. They'll claim to debunk myths that aren't myths.
Right.
And yes, character assassination, personal attacks, all of that is.
I think I've seen some of our chat family chase some of those away, in fact.
Oh, it goes on all the time.
Yeah, I know.
On these
I know.
talks that we do.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Like, I don't read them when they're live, but sometimes I'll go back over them and it's like, oh yeah, you can tell, the trolls are there. And who are the trolls? Well, sometimes they're just guys living in their mom's basement, I have no doubt, with no outlook for anything else except to stir up controversy. But I think in many cases, or in some cases, we don't know how many, it's something more than that, right? So, and Atkinson's, her main thing is she says, look, you find these propagandists, these astroturfing propagandists who, like, instead of questioning authority, they question those who question authority. They question
the questioner. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what they do.
That always stuck with me.
They question the questioners. So, and it's not like every single time you question authority, you're right. But this, like, what would it be like if we lived in a world where we're not able to question authority, which is where we're moving? Like, everyone can see this happening. It is happening. And, we've got to find a way not to let this just happen. Like, people who've got the ability to speak up, whether you've got a YouTube channel or whether you just have friends who like to listen to you once in a while, like, cannot let this happen. And I think, if we stand strong and if we're principled about it, we have a chance. But right now we're moving into an era where the walls are closing in on people who truly do think differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy because you hear this as a cliche motto, think different, think differently.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's the opposite.
Right.
It's actually happening. Let me share the screen with, this is a quote.
This is not a meme.
That's right. People see this statement. This is William Casey. And this is a statement that's out there. He says, we'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the U.S. public believes is false. That's such an outrageous statement. People might think that's got to be not true.
Well, that's what I thought when I first saw it. Absolutely.
It is true. It's exactly true. And in fact, if someone were to research this, you will find this was recorded by a genuine journalist who's got a really great reputation. Her name is Barbara Honegger, and she was sitting in the audience in February 1981 when Casey made this statement. She's written about it. I think you can take her word to the bank on this one. But so Casey's CIA director, the official Mockingbird program was over by the time he made this statement. This is several years after the whole thing kind of was exposed. And here he is just saying, yep, we got this, boss. He was talking to President Reagan. I think it, according to Honegger, it came in response to when Reagan became president. He was a little bit shocked or distressed to find that most of the CIA's intelligence came from open sources, which I think is probably most intelligence agencies. But here's Casey essentially reassuring the press that, nope, we've got this and we've got our whole disinformation program going. You don't need to worry about it. Right. True statement. So then we got this guy, Jesse Ventura, which, by the way, when he was elected mayor of the great state of Minnesota back in the 1990s, and I didn't know anything about Jesse Ventura back then, except that he'd been a pro wrestler. Championship wressler. And I just thought back then, this is over 20 years ago, what has happened to the people of Minnesota? Pardon me, that's me coughing now. I thought they'd lost their minds. Well, how little I knew. Jesse Ventura is the bomb. And this is him. He's got a show on RT. There's RT again. Hooray. This is a great interview he did on his show. I think about a year or two ago, not more than that. And he's talking about in 2003, after he was no longer governor of Minnesota, he said, look, my social profile was at an all-time high. Everyone wanted me at that time. So he said there was a bidding war on him between CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News back in 2003. This is just before the war in Iraq started. So he says, let me just got his quote right here. MSNBC won. I was supposed to have a 5-day-a-week show. He says, I think in Rachel Maddow's spot. It's kind of funny. He said, unfortunately, right before the Iraq war, we got a phone call wanting to know if I opposed the war, which I did. And then they asked if I would switch my position, which I wouldn't. And subsequently, they pulled my show and wouldn't let me on the air because of my resistance and my opposition to the Iraq war. And then he just goes on and says, what would the Middle East be like today if we hadn't invaded Iraq? This is a direct quote. I meticulously transcribed this from the interview that he gave. And it goes on. He says, it didn't end there. MSNBC also brought back Phil Donahue, who likewise opposed the invasion of Iraq. Phil, and I don't think I realized this at the time. He said Phil was their highest rated show, and yet he was yanked immediately. And this is the part they paid me all 3 years. And my contract, he said, was a very large one. By paying me all 3 years, I had to honor the contract. I couldn't do any cable TV or news programs. So in essence, they silenced me.
So they bought him out.
Yeah.
And he couldn't speak to anyone.
They bought him out, and people, some cynic might say, well, you took the money, so you got nothing to complain about. But the way that it works, like I think it's fair to say that Jesse Ventura did not expect to be able to sign a contract and then be denied that position. But because he signed the contract, now he's basically he's not able to compete. He had a non-compete clause in the contract. So no, I'm sure he did not anticipate that whatsoever.
As is pretty normal, the non-compete.
Yes, exactly. But what wasn't normal, or at least what he didn't expect, is that he would sign the contract and then they wouldn't honor it, but they would pay him and give it to someone who supported the war.
Right.
So that's the way it was. Years ago, back in 2006, I'll never forget this. I mentioned this once or twice, but I did a TV show back then. It was owned by NBC, Paramount. It was for the Sci-Fi Channel. So I got to deal with a lot of NBC producers. This is 2006. And
we need to find snippets of this.
Well, it's not that great. But we had a lot of downtime. And during downtime here, I was like, going off on all kinds of subjects. And this is in 2006 when, at that time, the mainstream media finally began to say, oh, those weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that we got so worked up about, maybe that really wasn't the case. Now, I'll just say to you, in 2003, when Colin Powell gave his speech to the United Nations, all right, about the WMDs in Iraq, that our intelligence agencies were so confident we're there, and he's showing all these pictures. And he actually said, these satellite images, well, you can't make out what this is, but I can tell you these are like mobile units for the Iraqis to send their nukes a-flying. And I knew, sitting up all by my lonesome in Rochester, New York, that was complete BS. Because there was already, even then, enough information out to know that was a lie.
Right.
And I stood up from the couch probably 5 or 10 times during that speech, pointed at the screen in my manner, and shouted in front of my kids, who were a lot younger back then, bullshit.
Right.
And I was so angry over that speech. That was the day that Colin Powell could have become a great American. He could have been a great person. He had the opportunity at that moment to halt that speeding train, because he knew, but he didn't. Whatever his reasons were, maybe they threatened him, which there are rumors about that. I don't know what the truth was.
Very possible.
But he didn't do it. And he will, there will be a day when all the hagiographies and the turning people into saints stops, and we actually look back with a cold, clear eye on this era, and they'll see the sellout that he engaged in on that moment. And it's shameful. I was shameful by him. But anyway, my point is,
I'm sure it wasn't just a decision on his part, but you acknowledge that.
Well, sure, everyone's pressured, and he just gave into it. The point was, when I was on this TV shoot a couple of years later, and now here's the mainstream media saying, oh, well, the weapons of mass destruction, perhaps we didn't get it right. I was talking to my producer, who was an NBC producer, and I said, the real theme here isn't false information, but how about falsified information? How about the fact that the intelligence reports were knowingly fake, and that you guys at NBC knew this? And he just looked at me. Oh, the other thing I said is, and by the way, it's never too late to correct even a horrible mistake like that. You guys can go on the news tonight, and you can explain that this whole war went on in knowingly false pretext. And he looked at me, and then he just looked past me, and he said, do you realize we're owned by General Electric, which at the time that they were, he says, one of the largest defense contractors. He just put it right out for me. He says, do you honestly think that anyone at NBC is going to go against the largest or second largest defense contractor in the country that owns them? And that was the end of the conversation.
Exactly. I think that's an important thing for us to realize. There's this tight spider web attached to all these people.
That's right.
You know, I don't think they're always choosing to do these things. You know, reporters aren't always, aren't necessarily bad people. They are stuck in a spider web. They are trying to make a living, and sometimes
The ordinary people, right? You can't have sympathy for them. They're just trying to get a paycheck.
yeah.
They're basically being controlled, and those ordinary people have to, at some point, they have to make a decision.
It's right. It's
Right.
true.
So
It's true. Yeah.
what side are you going to come down on? And some people like Amber Lyon she actually didn't quit. She got laid off. She got let go by CNN, but in retrospect, she made the right choice. Cheryl Atkinson made the right choice. Udo Ulfkota made the right choice. Other
people might look at Udof and, I don't know what the circumstances were fully around that, but I don't know what
around his death.
I don't know what these people's lives are like now, but we all know that when you go against the grain like that, it is not easy.
Well, this is Julian Assange's case.
Mhm.
It's Snowden's case.
Right.
I'm
not saying it's not important. It is important.
Right.
But just recognizing that it can be very
But they
difficult
pay
and
a price.
challenging. And yeah.
Right. The thing that I just want people to understand is this media complex is so deeply in bed with military industrial complex. So you find like all these ex-CIA guys, all these ex-generals and who get to be the talking head on Fox or CNN or MSNBC or whatever. They're all warmongers, every last one of them. They all want the next latest, greatest war to happen. Some of these people, I think, like they've just got blood dripping from their eyes with glee, waiting to make it happen. And that's America's entire political establishment for the most part, with a very few exceptions. Tulsi Gabbard, one of the great exceptions. But by and large, the political establishment and the media establishment are neocon empire builders who are creating a global system that America is going to dominate. That's what they're all about. And so let's talk about Snowden. Oh, one other thing that came out in that interview with Jesse Ventura, by the way, he had a gentleman on. I can't remember his name. We both saw this.
Yeah.
He pointed out how media consolidation occurs. And back in the early 60s, I was looking for this number, actually, and he kind of gave me the number. During the 1960s, a company was only allowed to own 5 stations in America in terms of radio or TV or whatever. So 5 was the limit. He said that there were 1,500 different owners of television and radio stations back then. So it's been consolidated to such an extent that you now have 6 or possibly, I think it's 5 major corporations that own roughly 90% of all major media that you will consume in the course of your day.
I know, isn't that incredible? I think that's one of those other foundational things that we all need to know when we're listening to something. Who owns it?
Right.
Who owns it ultimately?
The internet's blown things out a little bit. So now you've got Google, you've got Facebook, you've got other major players that own a lot of media. I mean, Google owns YouTube, which is what we're on right now. So we're able to say what we're saying, and we're not being censored. Although every single time I do a show, I wonder, are they going to? When is the hammer going to come down?
And as we've told people, sometimes we do have to appeal.
Right. So
right after the show. So we don't always get away scot-free.
I get brought in. We get brought into the YouTube principal's office every so often, and we have to deal with that. But YouTube, Google, Facebook, they're media companies too. So it's a little bit more confusing now. Like, how do you gauge what are the largest media? But all of them are very much in bed with intelligence community operatives and national security. They're all part of it. So speaking of which, let's bring Snowden into here.
Yeah.
There he is. So this is one of the many articles that came out on Snowden in the immediate aftermath of his revelations about 5 years ago now. This one is on the organization called JT-RIG, or Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group. This is out of the UK. These are the British military cyber warfare guys, basically. And Here's an article about them by Glenn Greenwald in The Intercept. So these guys were responsible basically for launching false flags against individuals, but also in other ways of to destabilize people that they didn't like, or conspiracy people, or alternative research type people, anyone that they thought was a threat to the establishment, and not just radical like Islamic terrorists. They went after. So one of the tactics, this is in Greenwald's article, deploying sexual honey traps designed to discredit targets. So, and this could be against women and men, but I would imagine much more against men, you know, a beautiful woman or a beautiful sexual partner that they would like to have, used against them to put them into a compromising position and thereby control or destroy them.
Right.
The attempt was made against Glenn Greenwald, as a matter of fact, which he talked about a number of years ago. Or launching denial of service attacks to shut down internet chat rooms, pushing propaganda that's like AstroTurf propaganda, like Cheryl Atkinson talks about, onto social networks. And as Greenwald puts it, generally warping discourse online. And there's Cass Sunstein. I guess we'll just talk about him and then we can probably wrap this up soon. So this man here, he's kind of famous, and he's a lawyer and a judge. He was hired by the Obama administration. I think he had a high position in the Department of Justice. And his real claim to fame is he wrote a paper. In fact, this is the article here. I looked it up. You could find it online, called Conspiracy Theories. But essentially what he argues in this is, in the fight against conspiracy theories, which he believes are very destructive to our society, it's important for intelligence officials to infiltrate conspiracy-oriented groups. And not all ways to, as he put it, not in every instance to, let me stop the screen share here, to undermine them with black flag or false flag type operations, but with persuasion and with counter information and so forth. That was part of what he was recommending. But also, who knows where that would stop? You know, you're infiltrating conspiracy groups. Where would it end?
Right.
You know, you want to destabilize them. So with the JT Rig group in the UK, we know what they were involved in. They were actually absolutely trying to be involved in destroying people's lives and careers if it came down to it. Sunstein was arguing the exact same thing. Last slide I want to show people. Cass Sunstein taught at Harvard, or at least he, I think he got his PhD there, or he taught there. And this is an article about a lady who is also a Harvard professor, and she's really doing exactly the same argument here. This was just the other day in Vox. Of course, they're ultra mainstream over there. And this is an article, Why Conspiracy Theories Are Getting More Absurd and Harder to Refute. And her argument, this is about her, it's not by her. The argument is that conspiracy theories, which by the way, in her estimation, are all right-wing. There are no left-wing conspiracy theories. They're all right-wing conspiracies, and they're all wrong. Like, this is absolutely her opinion. Wow. None have been proven to be true. I don't know how she, like, they didn't ask her about the Kennedy assassination. Like, is that not true? Like, is there no conspiracy to kill JFK? She didn't get into that. I think that would have been a very difficult. Of course, they wouldn't talk about 9/11, but she would simply dismiss that as conspiracy theory. None of these have been proven to be true. Where do you teach at Harvard? You would think you'd have an ability to be able to see ultimate different sides of a of something, but no conspiracies are true. And the other thing that she said in this article, and this I think is where we're headed for in our society, she says you cannot reason with conspiracy theorists. The author of the article is interviewing her. He says, well, can we show them facts to change their opinion? She says, no, basically you can't.
It's
doesn't
like
work.
she's talking about them like they're a pit bull or something. or
Yeah.
you know, some animal that you absolutely cannot tame.
Good point.
You can't speak reason to.
No, right.
I don't want to say that about pit bulls.
No, you like pit bulls.
I do.
She's a fan.
I don't want to, but yeah, just the way she's saying that, it's like some lost cause that people can't use reason. That's
Yeah, but think about it. So now they don't
talk about being stuck in a groove in an ideology.
in that
You
article.
can't break
Right.
out of your own or recognize your own
No, your own
stuck
blinders,
position.
absolute
Mhm,
blinders.
mhm.
So in
At
that
least be
article,
open. My gosh.
they don't go to the ultimate conclusion, which is that conspiracy groups need to be banned. But that's really where they're going.
Mhm.
Like when you say these people cannot be reasoned with, what else is there then? If you can't reason with them, then you've got to put them in quarantine, basically.
Mhm.
How do you put them in quarantine? Well, you deplatform them. So I'm sure, I would assume she favors all of that.
Yeah.
Which is probably what Cass Sunstein, another Harvard luminary, would probably prefer. You just put them in quiet time, isolation, and you don't give them a platform to speak. So you
Right.
contain the virus. Her argument
Right.
is that a society needs a certain kind of consensus for us to build so we can have common language, which I wouldn't even necessarily disagree with all of that.
Mhm.
But of course, what people like her are arguing doesn't really take into account the fact that conspiracy theories arise for a reason.
Right.
They arise when you have an opaque government that doesn't listen to you, that
Right.
provably engages in illegal activities
Mhm.
on a regular basis. So, of
Mhm.
course, many of those conspiracies are true, and some may not turn out to be exactly true. But, you know, the whole phrase conspiracy theory
I was
was
wondering
a
if you were gonna bring this
creation.
up.
It was a creation of the CIA back in the 1960s in a paper they wrote. I'd be very interested in coming back to that
I
and
think we should.
doing a little thing on that here. But it actually was created by the CIA in the 60s as a propaganda tool to disable the then growing school of people who had alternative opinions on the Kennedy assassination,
Mhm. Mhm.
which was just only a few years earlier.
Mhm.
And the CIA is looking at this growing number of doubters,
Mhm.
JFK truthers, you might say,
Mhm.
thinking, we got to do something about this. And one of the tactics was use the phrase conspiracy theorist or conspiracy theory and insert it into the media to
Right.
disable the credibility
Right.
of those people. And here we are 52 years later.
Right.
And, you know, and it's being used by the establishment on a daily basis,
Yeah.
multiple times every day.
Yeah. For anybody who's questioning. Right.
I think I read recently that YouTube announced that their algorithms, something like 10 million times a week, or is it tens of millions of times a week, are intercepting, whether fake news or intercepting things that are uploaded to YouTube in the need to curate
Oh wow.
and de-rank and whatever. So it's multiple millions of times per
Right.
week
Right.
that YouTube engages in basically inserting their
Editing.
finger-wagging moralism,
Right.
which is really all it is,
Right.
against the rest of us to protect us from bad think.
Right.
So this is what Mockingbird is about today. This is what Mockingbird has become. You know, we did an earlier show. I think we called it the new censorship, and this is really the kind of theme. This is what it's about. It's
Mhm.
it's not, you know, anything so, you know, spy versus spy, like, you know, secret people on the payroll. Like, that's not what it's about anymore.
Right.
There is secrecy. There
Mhm.
are deep, dark, false flags being done against people, but it's much more pervasive now than ever before, and it's almost out in the open.
Mhm.
So that's Mockingbird. That's the system, and
Mhm.
it's not getting better. It's getting worse.
Yeah, because now we have the whole social media layer on top of everything else.
Boy.
Mockingbird was journalism, media, but yeah, it's pervasive now.
You know, I think it was like a week ago, someone got on my case in some comment to one of my videos, and I was talking about the internet, and I've said for years, and I said back in the mid 1980s or late 80s, early 90s, the internet as it's become was not a foreseen eventuality by the powers that be. The amount of freedom that came out was not anticipated, and they had to kind of get a whole thing under control. And someone called me out and just said, look, the internet was created by those powers that be. And to some extent, there's a lot of truth to that. Not 100%, but there is truth to it. But I would still argue that no, like go back to 1990, 1985. I don't think anyone could have seen the breadth, the depth, the pervasiveness of what this connectivity has been able to do. But I think it is true, as this person was saying, and I agree that, the intelligence community, the powers that be, right? They've always had a plan. And the plan has always been to manage this new system, this new structure, this internet for their benefit. And I think what's happened in the last 5 years, particularly, it's been very obvious. They've become very, very good at this, like even better than ever before. Putting in new laws to regulate more and more, to further restrict our ability to have a true, open, free conversation about almost anything now.
And there are a lot of people who don't see it. They don't see it at all.
What do you mean they don't see? What don't they see?
They're just accepting the reality as is.
Oh, yeah,
and they don't believe that there's anything wrong with what's going on. That they're not fully aware. I'm talking about people who aren't aware. Right. They don't know that there's a level of deception. They don't know.
Well,
they don't know that any of this is happening. They are completely unaware that the news that they are receiving
is totally pre-digested for them.
Yeah. I just want to read this quote that I thought was so good. And this was on Jesse Ventura.
Oh, yeah.
He was talking, this was Roger Ailes, Nixon's former media advisor, said.
Roger Ailes, yeah, founder of Fox. Fox.
It's not what you put on the news that changes the world. It's
right.
what you don't put on the news that changes the world.
That's right.
That really stuck with me.
Exactly. It's what is left out of the picture.
What is going on behind? I mean, and gosh, when you think about it, you just hear Trump and these character assassinations, and just we're focusing on the weirdest things. I'm so glad we don't have a TV. I mean, we have a TV, but we don't watch the news every day. And we don't.
And keep in mind, this is not like we're supporters of Trump. We're really not. I didn't vote for him. You didn't. Of course, I sleaze out. I didn't vote for anyone. But and he is completely, in my opinion, like the people who are still into Q and think that he's going to be the liberator. Not buying that for an instant. I think he's been completely cornered and surrounded by the neocons. I mean, I don't think he's got any magic tricks to pull out here. I could be wrong, but I just don't see it. And on top of that, he says a lot of things that tell me he knows very, very little about international relations and geopolitics.
Right.
Having said that, what you're getting at, if I may just say, I will say this until I can't say it anymore. The reason that the establishment media went after him as a candidate, forget the presidency, as a candidate, was because he talked against the two pillars of America's ruling establishment desires, which is neoconservative empire and neoliberal globalization. And, whether he meant it or not is a whole other thing. But when you talk against those things when you talk about the U.S. getting out of NATO, for example, like no one would do that. Talking against all the wars, which not the most liberal Democrat, not Bernie Sanders was doing that. And Trump, this crazy trash talker from Queens, was doing that. That's insane, but he was. So as president, it's in many ways, I would say, a very different story. But the invective that was against him has nothing to do with his personality. It's totally irrelevant. It has everything to do with the policies that he promoted as a candidate, which were anathema to what people now will call the deep state. And I think that analysis is totally 100% correct. it doesn't make him into a saint by any means, and doesn't make him into even making right decisions all the time, which he doesn't. But I think people need to understand the reason that he has been attacked is for that. And when you have a media complex that is, for the most part, and Fox will support him because Fox is Fox and they like Republicans. And I think that's pretty much, for the most part, all I see from them. So it's very opportunistic. So I don't think they're any more principled than CNN, I guess is what I'm saying. But the point is that he put himself in opposition to the vast bulk of the neocon and the neoliberal establishment, and they will never forgive. You just can't go out and get elected with that type of a platform. So that's what we're seeing, and it will continue until it's over.
Right. Well, actually, what I was saying was I wasn't taking a position. I was just saying that news is focused on these things that are irrelevant, as opposed to what's really going on underneath. That's all I meant.
Exactly.
That's all I meant. Yeah.
Exactly. So I didn't mean to get too off track
No,
there,
well,
it's
I
a crazy
think that's good
thing.
as
Like
well.
anytime anyone talks about Trump to like an open group, which this is, because we don't really get into the partisan politics on this show, like really ever.
Right.
So there's always a danger. Like someone's going to say, "Oh my God, he's so right wing," and you hear that. And I hear that. And I'm like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
My whole life, I've never been that. But I think what happened is that our society took some kind of iOS upgrade a couple of years ago, and I didn't get the upgrade. So here I am, like, wait, what? What happened to this society? But anyway, so we can move on, and that's really everything I've got to say on the new Mockingbird.
Yeah.
I think we can probably wind this part down.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we covered it. We've had so many people from the member site write in, and just sometimes they get a chance to a little bit more of an ear, not always, but sometimes. And this is the kind of thing they're wondering about, because this is, we'll talk about UFOs and things like that, but Mockingbird is something and media control is something that is affecting us every day, and we really need to be aware of this. And I just want to bring it to this because I can just hear people saying this in my head. It's so confusing figuring out good sources for news. I know this happens when we're at conferences too. People writing in, as I was saying, how do they navigate this? How do they try to navigate this?
Well, one easy way, like you hear, this is what the mainstream, their great strength is saying, look, we're vetting our sources. We're curating our news for you. So there's a simple rule here, okay? If you really want to form an opinion on something, read one opinion and then read the opposite opinion. Just find an opposing point of view. Like if you're a Republican, find some liberal Democrat opinions to listen to. If you're a liberal Democrat, find some Republican points of view to listen to. Like people don't want to do that. In the UFO field, where we reside, if you are a believer in UFOs, find some skeptical opinions. If you're a skeptic, find some pro-believer opinions. Like it's just a good idea in general.
Yeah.
So one thing people really need to do is to seek out opposing points of view, like really seek them out and really listen.
Right.
Like that's the whole thing. Like if you listen to opposing points of view, you will realize the world is a little bit more nuanced than what everyone's trying to tell you. And maybe you won't demonize someone the next time as well, which is always usually a good thing. So that's like rule number one. Find opinions that you disagree with, but really try to listen and don't necessarily be persuaded by them, but like at least if you disagree, know why you disagree and don't just knee jerk it.
Right.
Like really try your best to understand. And I think in enough time, you will realize, oh, there are other ways of looking at something. And there is something that's being missed, left out of our news. This is why I talk about RT sometimes. RT's been demonized by the Western news media, but the fact is that they frequently will provide perspectives that are utterly absent. And not just perspectives, but genuine information,
Right.
factual information that is relevant,
Right.
that never appears. Now, RT isn't alone. There are other sources out there that I have always liked and I'll look for. But it's not the site that I'm interested in, it's the information. So I look for information that gives me information, if that makes sense. I look for sites that give me information, and I look for sites that give me engaging perspectives. And that's really all I care about. And when a website stops doing that, then I usually will stop going there. Except in the case of Western news, I do kind of masochistically read Western headline and news stories every day. And in the morning, like you'll see me doing that for at least 30 minutes. And I'll look at other sources. I'll look at RT and I'll look at other places out there, but I'll read the Western news and I'll read non-Western news every day.
I think it's tough also for people because, I mean, we all have such a limited amount of time. So people are looking for shortcuts and hacks of how to get the best information in the quickest way.
But there is none.
And this is one advantage that you really have, is because you sort of dedicate yourself to this. It's like an obsession to read, to intake as much as you can from different perspectives, and then, decipher it and offer up your opinion. But most people don't have the time to try to do that themselves.
No, it's totally true.
The time or they don't have the background, or they don't have like something that you bring as well as this geopolitical, historical viewpoint that people who are newer into this don't have. So I always appreciate that myself.
Well, one of the frustrating things is like I've spent now 40 years of my life since I was in my late teens, maniacally studying things like this.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's still like, I still have a long way to go. I feel there's still so much that I do not know. And so that's frustrating to me because I think I've been blessed with the ability to study this stuff. I've been able to devote most of my time or a lot of my time to it. And, I've considered myself at least reasonably okay at studying this. And yet here I am sometimes still feeling like, how much more do I need to study?
Yeah.
And most people aren't in that situation. And so the reality is like, it's not going to happen for most folks. And it's easy to just want to let it go, because when I'm out doing yard work, I want to let it go too. I just want to like chop the wood, collect the leaves, bring the stuff out like I did earlier today. And I love that.
It's your balance. Yeah.
It is. So, and for most of us, we need that. We want to be able to have a part of our lives where we're not thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of sympathy for, like, when I was younger, I'm sure when you were younger, I'm guessing, it's very easy to be judgmental about people if they don't know this or they don't know that. But here's the thing, like, I grew up with a lot of wonderful, beautiful people who are not all that well educated. I had a grandmother, God bless her. She was one of the sweetest, angelic people I've ever known. And she was not well educated.
Right.
So am I to judge her and billions of other people who are exactly like that? I mean, most people just don't have the energy. They don't understand how to decipher through the matrix.
Well, and
it's hard to do.
And they want to be able to trust who they've deemed their authority, or who they believe is their governing authority. A lot of people still have that faith, they have that trust.
Man, it is so difficult.
And they don't think to look into these alternative discussions, So one thing we can do is not, judge each other so harshly. Oftentimes people just haven't come around to the information.
I agree with that. It's very easy, and it's sometimes I have to guard myself from falling into judging other people for different reasons. And like, you pointed this out to me, when we're alone, I'll bitch and moan about someone, and then I meet them, and it's always a little different. Like, you find, oh, there's actually a human being in there.
Well, yeah, and then the human being gets to explain their point of view. I was watching, I just was cruising all around the net, looking at stuff with Julian Assange, and I saw this. It wasn't a TED talk, but I think I'm not sure who he was, if he runs TED or he curates it, but he sat down with Julian Assange and they were having a discussion. And what was so nice about it was it seemed like, because I didn't see it from beginning to end, is he didn't necessarily agree, but he was trying to have a calm discussion and really just understand the parts that he didn't understand about what Julian was doing.
Right.
He wanted to understand his background, he wanted to understand his motivation, and he wanted to understand, don't you think that some of these things need to be secret for national security? And he was really taking the time to listen to what Julian had to say. And I thought that is what we need. We really need to try to hear each other.
Didn't you say that was a TEDx and not a TED?
No, that was something different.
Oh,
that
okay.
was something completely different. That was to do with Snowden, where I said it was someone from the Guardian newspaper who interviewed Snowden originally when
probably Glenn Greenwald, I would imagine.
It wasn't. It was someone else. Luke Harding.
Yes.
And I was saying I was so surprised he was doing a TEDx talk, which is sort of a locally organized TED versus a full-on TED. I couldn't believe it. It was really good, by the way, if you want to check that out. But that's the one I was talking about. As far as Julian Assange, this was something super different. It was not a TEDx talk, and perhaps it was on the heels of something else. But it was a fantastic discussion, not this, you're wrong. It was, let's try to understand each other.
Right.
I have deep appreciation for that.
TED has its limits, in my opinion. Like,
I'm not saying anything great about TED.
Right.
I'm not talking about TED.
But
I'm just
that
talking
conversation.
about that type of conversation, that type of discussion where we are trying to understand from each other.
Yeah, just listen.
Because oftentimes it's because, like we were saying, people haven't come around to that information for one reason or another.
It's true. And on the one, by the way, a couple of people mentioned Chris Hedges in the chat. I'm a big fan of Chris Hedges. So yes, the situation seems very hopeless when you look at certain elements of it. The fact that most people are just they're not up to the ability to critique the media that feeds them, essentially. And that is true. But it's also true that there are people who have understood it and are putting their positions out there.
Yeah.
And as long as there is a free flow of information, we've got a chance.
Right.
So we're in danger when that free flow of information is curated and restricted by Google and YouTube and Facebook, and of course the whole mainstream establishment, that whole legacy establishment. So that's what we've got to fight. We have to just we basically fight for a free flow of information is our number one goal, I think.
Yep, I would agree with that. Absolutely.
So do we have time for any questions, or should we wrap this up here?
We do.
I think
we can. Oh my goodness.
Okay,
we're just looking here. I just want to say, oh my goodness, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Everyone's so active, and thank you for the super chats and all the support. Wow. This wow. Okay, so we're going to look for questions here. Let's just see.
Anything here? Thank you, Richard, for being the ballast. I thought it was ballast, but he means ballast. That keeps these subjects from spinning or being spun out of orbit. So much disinformation. Is there anything else in there? So it's just a nice little.
You're right, Connie. I'm taking another one.
Personal comment. Yeah. Oh, this is someone else, but I'll just say the left wingers think Richard is a neocon and the right wingers think he's a complete liberal. It's so funny. Yeah. Back in, I think it was in early 2000s, I did a lecture in Minneapolis, and these two older gentlemen came up to me and said, we would like for you to resolve an argument that we're having. I believe you're a Republican, and my friend here believes that you're a Democrat. And I just laughed. I said, well, I'm actually really glad that you can have that argument, because I would never want my personal or even political analysis to have me confined into any one of those parties. So, and the fact is I'm neither. So anything else we see there? Would Richard take a moment to talk about manipulation of the media and how it correlates with the manipulation of those who follow ufology by the media, government, and scammers within ufology? I think I get where you're going here. And in fact, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. We were going to do a UFO theme this evening, and it just didn't happen. We got into this, which I'm glad about. But within the UFO field, first of all, one thing that has to be said about the UFO subject within the media and its treatment by the media, which is that it has always been ridiculed. It's always been pushed aside. In fact, I was considering putting up a few slides dealing with Washington Post, horrific coverage of the UFO phenomena by the Washington Post. And in fact, I forgot, let me just show these slides since I put these together actually some time ago for some lecture. But you've got a situation in the mainstream where I have here establishment posing as hip. So you got Mother Jones, you've got the Daily Beast, you know, the so-called, this isn't the New York Times, this is, you know, mainstream for the young people, but they trash talk UFOs as well, even though they're not alternative. Like the Daily Beast, for example, as I point out here, they're owned by a company called IAC. They're a holding company. They're totally mainstream. Goldman Sachs, Chase, Morgan Stanley, the whole bit. Washington Post, of all the mainstream newspapers, probably has had the worst, most egregious, awful, useless, propagandistic coverage of UFOs, more even than the New York Times. And this is just some of their articles over the years, just terrible. And this is when we did the congressional hearings back, the citizen hearings organized by Steve Bassett in 2013. Just one after the next, the conspiracy religion, UFOs and you, and all of this absolute garbage. So I guess what I'm saying is the mainstream has had an attitude on UFOs. And the reason that UFOs have had to be marginalized for all this time is very simple. UFOs are important. They're a national security matter. They've always been a national security matter. And if you absolutely must not have the public talking about UFOs in a way that you don't like, then you've got to contain it. You've got to create ridicule. You've got to create a kind of sense of consensus around it. Is there anything in there interesting you're looking for? Hold on. Notre Dame. Well, let me just finish my thought here, and we can. I don't really have a lot to say about the Notre Dame thing yet. I don't know enough about how and why that all happened.
Yeah, people are saying there's a conspiracy and that it's a distraction from something else.
Well, YouTube has a little something to do with that, which YouTube itself connected that to 9/11. I'll talk about that in a second. But
and here the Yellow Vest movement is what Coyote Girl was bringing
good.
up.
Well, that's all interesting. The last thing about the UFO subject, and we constantly have to ask ourselves, to what extent is the UFO movement hijacked and victim of disinformation by the types of organizations that Snowden revealed, or Cass Sunstein's type of situation of having, you know, intelligence groups infiltrate conspiracy groups? And that's a tricky question because we don't really know how widespread that is. We don't really understand. We don't have a sense of it. But all people have our suspicions. So I have suspicions. Other people have suspicions. Who's an operative and who's not an operative? It's constantly on our mind. But I'm going to tell you right now, there's no way I'm going to throw out names until I get proof, because otherwise you've got libel lawsuits. You got all of this stuff going on, and I can't prove it. But definitely, I would say the UFO subject and culture has been a target, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure.
So do you want to comment on this with the Yellow Vest movement?
So Coyote Girl said, Richard and Tracy, hello, so nice to see you. It's a bit off topic, but I feel it's relevant to speak on Notre Dame fire, mass trauma, distraction from the Yellow Vest movement. Well, The LFS movement doesn't get any coverage in in like the United States, and it's very important indeed. And it's, you do notice how the establishment media likes to characterize them as right wing. What a load of nonsense that appears to be. They're just ordinary people who are sick and tired of a lot of the elements of French micromanaged, bureaucratized society. The word right wing is such a smear that's being labeled by the establishment. It's really becoming so over the top, so heavy handed. The fire at Notre Dame or Notre Dame, I don't really know what to say about it. Like everyone's saying it was accidental, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know. All I know is what.
And is it
they're
connected
saying.
to all the other churches?
Well, there's been a spate of attacks and
10.
vandalism and burnings of French churches. That's right. So I don't know. For me, it's way too early. I haven't investigated. I don't know. But I will say that, God, I had a whole thing here. It was in my head, and it's just now. Can you?
Did I move the question? Sorry.
Oh, one thing is that YouTube's stupid algorithms initially listed all coverage of the Notre Dame fire as connected to 9/11, and they put some kind of 9/11 wiki link to it. Yeah,
Really?
Yeah, really, they did.
I didn't know that.
And they made a big apology about it and said, sorry, our algorithms were, because apparently the fire at Notre Dame, how that triggered a YouTube response to connect it with 9/11 is
that's
20 years ago.
An artificial intelligence response, probably, because we know that it looks at images.
Yeah.
And categorizes them together. So it probably did something like that.
Right, exactly. So what was YouTube all about? And they issued their little apology, and it's kind of ridiculous. Thanks, YouTube. This is exactly why we need a nanny like YouTube to tell us what's safe and what's not. My God, how ridiculous. But is it a distraction? I don't know.
We'll have to wait and see what happens in the next little while, right?
I wouldn't want to say.
A lot of people are saying UFOs over Notre Dame. I haven't heard anything about that yet. I don't know.
I'm just seeing this scroll up. Richard, has MUFON been infiltrated by the CIA, FBI at all in a major way? Is it now?
This is Brian.
Martin, thank you, Brian. Martin Stubbs claims they tried to keep him from releasing the smoking gun video while he was a local investigator. Oh, interesting. I want to find Martin Stubbs. I want to try to talk with him about this, do an interview. One thing that's very clear about MUFON and other UFO groups of the past is definite infiltration by intelligence operatives. Absolutely. It's an old, long history to that, and it's well attested. So the question is, what's the story with MUFON today? And I wouldn't care to make a big speculation on that right now. Some years ago, I talked quite a lot about my thoughts on where MUFON was going back then, and I thought it was in a very bad direction. But I'm not sure about now. I mean, I talked to Jan Harzan, who's the international director of MUFON, and I respect and I like Jan. I think he is genuinely working hard to promote MUFON and the UFO subject in the positive way. But infiltration, yes, I mean, we have to assume. If you're running an organization like MUFON, you've got to assume that there are people in there that are maybe answering to someone else. I'll just say that. I don't know for a fact, but I know that it was the case in the past, and it could be the case now, but I just don't know. Anything else here? This one? Do I believe that during Assange's time in the embassy that he created data dump triggers? Oh, yeah, in the event of his death or arrest. There's the so-called dead man's button that he supposedly has. And in fact, the story is that the UK police went in such a way to go in to catch him by surprise, not give him enough notice that they were taking him. I don't know all the details of that, but this is what I have heard. So there's a lot of talk that Assange has a dead man's switch, it's called, that he's got some information that he'll lay out. Well, if he's got it, we're waiting. I would like to see it. I'm not saying he doesn't. The question is, does he have access to it at this time? or not. So it's just one of those things that to wait and see, I suppose. Anything else here?
I just see this. Someone was saying, does Tracy smoke? Is that why I have this cough? No, I do not. I just have this weird lasting cough ever since we went to LA.
Getting a little bit better.
It's getting better.
It took some time.
Yeah.
We should probably wrap this up soon.
Okay.
So any others?
Let's see. We have something here from Mark H.
Oh, I like this one. So Mark H., the National Defense Authorization Act of 2013 gives the government use of propaganda against the people and become legal in the interest of national security. Exactly right. In fact, that's the NDAA. They've been renewing those for well over a decade now. So the NDAA has existed since at least 2004. It's amazing. And it's one of these awful, pernicious tacking on to the original USA Patriot Act, which was the real, I would say the USA Patriot Act was the real thing that broke the back of the classical American Republic. I mean, it's not that the American Republic hadn't been under bad times since before then. It certainly had been under assault, but clearly the USA Patriot Act, which was rammed through Congress without anyone even having the opportunity to read it, was passed in the midst of the phony anthrax scare. Remember that? Yeah. If I haven't, I did a live stream on the anthrax scare, which if you haven't seen that, I would recommend go back onto the YouTube channel and watch that one. So that's a true false flag of epic proportions. And I'm getting a little off topic from what Mark was asking here, but that anthrax scare was the 2 in the 1-2 punch.
Yeah, I have to admit, I did not know that for a long time.
Right.
Understanding how those two go together.
That anthrax scare was necessary. It was, if 9/11 had been a one-off, it could, in theory, be possible. And you could almost see people saying, well, okay, it was one thing. But with anthrax, first 9/11, now anthrax, like people in this country, I remember this really well, were going out of their minds with fear. And what are the terrorists going to do next? Like, they're crazy. And so it was not 9/11, but anthrax that was front row on the news during the whole debate in October of 2001 of the USA Patriot Act. And it was anthrax that really pushed it. You know, that Patriot Act was passed on October 24th of 01. It was 1 or 2 days later that it came out that, oh yeah, that anthrax appears to have been product of U.S. biological warfare, not Al-Qaeda. They knew that all along. Of course, the FBI had been doing studies of this, and they absolutely knew this. George Bush administration knew it, but of course they just let it ride. You know, that it was homemade. And here's the interesting thing about that anthrax. If it's homemade, which it was, then why the notes attached to it that were clearly designed to make people think it was Islamic terrorists? You know, first America, next, what was it? First 9/11, now this, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great, was what the messages said. Now, if that came from within the U.S., what's that all about? From U.S. bioweapons.
Right.
Okay, that's false flag, people. That's 100% false flag. And the U.S. media, by the way, was so complicit with that anthrax nonsense. Criminal complicity. You want to talk about fake news. New York Times, Washington Post, all those people, CNN, Fox, they all take the cake. They all push that narrative. And absolutely unconscionable. Anyway. All right.
I think it's probably time
to wrap
it up.
It is time.
And we won't take a half hour to do it, I promise. But we do want to tell people, we want to thank you, of course, for being here. All the people who are in chat, all the people who support Richard and watch his different shows and who comment and just support in all these different ways. We thank you.
Now, I want to take a moment just to thank everyone for your support, whether on the YouTube channel by subscribing or by supporting us or by supporting us on our members website. That's Richard Dolan Members. All of you help us and help me in the work that we're trying to do here. So I just want you to know that I want to thank you, and it means a great deal that you're there. And the other thing is, it's hard to keep doing this if you feel like you're just speaking into the wind. But if you know that there's people out there with whom that this resonates, that's always been the thing that keeps me going.
one of the easiest and free ways to support Richard's work is to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already.
YouTube channel.
The YouTube channel.
Right.
And you can turn on notifications and you will get notified when new shows are being uploaded.
They don't all come out at the exact same time. Like on Saturday, it varies a little. It could be 3
That's
Eastern,
right.
could be 4 Eastern, could be 2 Eastern. It's whenever I have it ready. That's really what it is. So I don't have a set time.
That's right. So there are 2 shows a week always. So there's this show Tuesday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern.
Right.
Then Saturdays, as Richard was saying, we don't know exactly when it's
Saturday
necessarily going to
afternoon.
come out. And then there's the Richard Dolan show, which is
Let's talk about that for a second.
let's.
So that aired
A lot
for
of people have
years
been
and
asking.
years. New episodes always aired every year on KGRA
Mhm.
radio.com Mondays. It's still on KGRA, but people need to know the fresh episodes of that show always air first on this YouTube channel.
That's right.
Nowhere else. This is the place where they are. And that's not every single week. It's most Mondays. There are occasional weeks off from that. So, for example, I did not have a new one this last Monday.
Right.
We're looking in. I think we'll have one for next Monday, but that's the way it is. So most Mondays, yes. Some Mondays, no. Always first on this channel. And the other thing is an hour here, and then the way it is, the second hour is always available at richardolanmembers.com.
Flatwoods Monster was an exception, so sometimes that will happen. It was 2 parts that were public, and then the 3rd part was on for members.
On our members.
So that
site.
will happen sometimes too.
That's right.
But there is on Richard's YouTube channel, there is a playlist called The Richard Dolan Show, and that is where you want to go to look. We have another place you can go. We're just organizing this on our member site right now. But there is a tab called Our Shows.
And that'll lead you to everything as well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty easy. Okay.
And we also have a free newsletter that we send out every Sunday. There are exceptions, of course. We had one last week where we couldn't send till Wednesday. But generally, they cover Sunday to Sunday night. And if you missed it, we let you know everything we did over the week. All of the free public content, all of the members' content, any announcements, and any events that we have coming up. Because I know sometimes people ask about that.
And that's it.
That's it.
I want to thank everyone for coming out. Someone just said, Richard, go rake some leaves. I intend to. Actually, leaves are all done. That's all done. I'm on to other things in that yard.
Yes.
But I love it out there.
Yeah. And the weather's finally getting nicer.
I go out in the rain. I don't care.
Well,
I'm out there. But
I was in Florida before.
Yeah, it's a little cold for you up here.
It's a little cold right now.
Well, everyone, thank you for being here with us. We appreciate it. We'll catch you next time. Until then, stay strong, stay brave, and don't let the bastards get you down.
Have a great night, everybody.
Bye.